Hello, this is psychomiki, and today we are going to talk about Jinx. I even did a look inspired by Jinx when she was in another timeline and she was powder. Well, I wanted to address this topic because I think the character is very well constructed, especially regarding her transition and personality development. We know her from when she was a little girl until she grows up and becomes Jinx. And I think this transition makes us understand her and even feel a deep empathy for her. Is the main character, and we can even come to identify with her. Even though she got hallucination, she got a super difficult and, of course, fictional life. In my case, I absolutely adore her. I love you, Jinx. But in this transition, we can see how she becomes the woman we see today. She begins her journey being called powder. And from the very start, she lives in a very violent and stressful environment. She loses her parents in a confrontation in Song when she's very, very little. Then she is taken in by Bander, who becomes this protective father figure for both her and her sister Vi. From the beginning, she comes from a marginalized social background, living in the undercity of Sound, surrounded by poverty, crime, and violence, all under the constant oppression from Piltover. In other words, not only she is growing up in an adverse family context, but she's also experiencing political marginalization. This chronically insecure environment becomes a constant source of stress. Can you imagine? Imagine growing up in a place where you don't know if you will wake up alive the next day, or even your whole family will be gone by tomorrow. Yeah, it's not very encouraging. In fact, studies show that prolonged exposure to violent events such as community violence and early losses, as Jinx had, can lead to complex post-traumatic stress disorder. In this part, I have to tell that not every person that lives in a chronically insecure environment has to develop complex post-traumatic stress. But the trauma, having a chronically insecure environment, it's not the reason why a person can have complex post-traumatic disorder. There is another part that it's that neurophysiology part that also take part of this. But in Jinx, we see in her development, because for example, in Bai, she doesn't have any hallucination or, well, of course, I'm not saying Bai is like, oh yeah, life is wonderful. But we see Bai a lot more stable than Jinx. Also, we have to remember Bai was bigger than Jinx when they lost their parents. So in Powder specifically, we can see these symptoms. Think about it. Powder experienced so many traumatic events that intertwine, affecting her basic sense of security. Have you ever felt like everyone was against you? For her, that was her constant feeling. We see how she never feels safe. That sense of insecurity turns into chronic stress, and chronic stress, in turn, leads to development issues. Not only on a neurophysiological or biological level, because also we know that the neurophysiology development can be affected by chronic stress, but also in her interpersonal relationships and the way she perceives the world. Her ideas and representations stem from fear, from the belief that the world is aggressive here and toward the people she loves. Yet, not everything is negative in Powder's life, because there is someone who, for her, is the most important attachment figure. Bai represents that primary attachment figure who protects her, gives her a sense of belonging, shows her affection, and takes care of her. We even see in the early episodes how, besides caring for her, Bai treats her in acknowledgement of her vulnerability. Because of course she's a little girl. Imagine you are Bai. She was like, I don't know, 15 in the first episodes. So imagine too having to take care of your little sister while also feeling utterly alone. You will be forced to shoulder the responsibility of an entire family. Powder, being so young, doesn't fully understand this, and it's natural she doesn't. However, it generates in her a feeling of weakness, insecurity, and even uselessness, especially since Milo even goes so far as to call her Jinx. In the episode 3, we witness the culminated event of the Powder's childhood, the actual transition from Powder to Jinx. This explosive moment happened when, in her attempt to help Bai and seek validation for her, she inadvertently triggers events that result in the death of her remaining attachment figures, Vander and her siblings, Milo and Clover. Powder wanted to prove her worth. She wanted to be accepted in the group, but it all ends in tragedy. Well, I'm sorry, spoiler alert. Consequently, the way she sees herself begins to shift. She starts believing that she brings bad luck and ruins everything she touches. Also because that's the phrase that she had been hearing. And also, every person that was important for her left her. It doesn't matter why, because she can understand very good, and we are going to talk about this a little bit later. This self-perception naturally leads her to isolate and marginalize herself, to define herself from the notion of being bad. After the explosion, it makes sense that Bai becomes disappointed. Not because Bai is angry with Powder, since what happened was, an accident and nor is Powder's fault that there were repression from Piltover, or that her parents died, or even that she was a little girl caught in this chaos. But Bai needs some time to process everything that was happening, and it's completely understandable as a grown-ups. But imagine being Jinx as a little kid. So your self-image becomes, I must be a horrible person, I'm destined to be abandoned, and that's why everyone hates me. And in that insecure, horrible world, that the only person who had ever been there for her, that was Bai, lives. And this is where Peter Fonagy's ideas about the lack of mentalization in traumatized children comes into play. Bai represents that primary attached figure. When Bai disappears, Jinx interprets it as total abandonment, a complete loss of support. This reactivates the trauma she already experienced with the death of her parents. Fonagy explains that this inability to mentalize, that is, to understand what other might be represented inside one's own mind. So, understand that the other one have another representation of the world and another way to feel than me. So, prevents children from regulating their emotions when they feel abandoned. After all, abandonment for a child, it's equal with the fear of death. Imagine being a child, you depend on your parents or in your figure that takes care of you until you are old enough to stand on your own, and you rely entirely in your attachment figures. So abandonment is terrifying in this age, and it instills a deep fear. When this abandonment occurs, and then Silco enters the picture, he becomes the only person in her world. Speaking of early development, consider the image of the monkey and the sources as a symbol of her childhood. The monkey even can be seen as a transitional object that, on one hand, connects her to the safety of her childhood before the explosion, and on the other hand becomes a symbol of guilt and a reminder of the trauma. According to Winnicott, transitional objects, like the monkey in this case, help children to manage the anxiety and the separation from the primary attachment figure. However, when these objects became associated with trauma, they can trigger emotional crisis. That is why every time things appear, you can see that distinctive graffiti of the monkey and everything like neon as an explosion. So going back to Silco. Silco emerged as a new attachment figure for Jinx. Rather than helping her to process her trauma, he reinforcing it, pushing her to become numb because, as a little girl, she doesn't yet understand. She must survive. At that moment, Jinx buries Powder, adopting a false self to create an image that can help her through this transitional phase. She starts acting with much more confidence, and also in a violent manner. She accepts being Jinx. She embraces all the self-concepts that once generated insecurities and doubt in her, doubt about being useless or bad, and comes to understand that she was truly that. She repressed the pain, the vulnerability, and the false self becomes her only means of existence. In doing so, she loses contact with Powder, leading a fragmentation of her identity, a split that becomes apparent when her hallucinations start to appear. Let's now discuss Jinx as seen through the eyes of Milo and Clayton. Throughout Arcane, we observe that Jinx experienced various hallucinations, particularly involving her siblings. This reflects her inability to process guilt and resolve her identity conflicts. She could never admit to herself that she was hurt. She buried that part. She buried Powder to hide the trauma. Powder feels guilt and sorrow for what happened, while Jinx feels anger and hatred for being abandoned. She turns everything into violence. And yeah, let's be honest, sometimes it's more comfortable to be angry than being sad. Yeah. And when Vi returns and tries to reclaim her, the crisis worsens. Jinx brings Powder back into the picture, which makes her question all the internal representations that had been sustaining her identity. I'm bad, I don't deserve to be with people, that's why I'm with Silco. I deserve to be bad and I deserve bad things because I'm Jinx. You have to understand that Powder's deep-seated insecurity was essentially about being left alone, about losing Vi. That was her biggest fear, which was her fundamental law, her driving force. Then Vi is forcibly arrested and taken away, though she doesn't realize it, and this only confirms the bias Powder already had, reinforcing her fear of abandonment. This cascade of losses all in one night, it's like a literal explosion in Jinx's psyche. The profound wound of loss generates desperate responses, an emotional detachment as a defense mechanism. If everyone you love is destined to vanish, then you protect yourself by not getting close to anyone, avoiding that overwhelming pain that could shatter your entire personality. Another aspect that Fonagy and Bateman discuss in mentalization is that it's understanding that another person's mind and internal representations are different from our own, and being able to grasp our own inner states as well as those of others, or at least hypothesize about them. This capacity is built on the foundation of a secure attachment relationship. The purpose that sensitive caregivers provide infants with the tool or internal representations to understand their own emotions. In contrast, a lack of a secure base hinder disability. Jinx, therefore, can't even understand what is happening to her. For example, when a child falls and scrapes their knee, parents can say, "Oh, don't worry, oh, it might hurt, but it's just a bit, it's not the end of the world." That's a reflection, that it's a way to process the emotion. A child doesn't fully understand that pain is not the end of the world. He only understands, oh, pain. So this reflection helps the kid to process that feeling, to understand that it's not the end of the world. But Jinx and Powder didn't have that. They have no framework to process that sensation. Jinx had no one to explain that the feeling of abandonment was because her sister was also hurting. Even though she loved her, it might have been as simple as hearing, "No, Jinx, Vi loves me. She really does. It's just she's mad right now." The one that helped her to regulate her own emotions, it shared the delicate interplay between the child and their attachment figure. That mirror which reflects our feelings is crucial. This dynamic where one person gets upset and another one explains the origin of that sadness is essential to emotional regulation. Then, when they grow up, they understand that feeling it's not the end of the world and they can auto-regulate themselves. The mirror which reflects our own feelings is crucial. Without it, Jinx's internal world becomes a breeding ground from paranoia, causing her to misinterpret her entire relationship with Vi and with others. For instance, when Vi is seen with Caitlyn, Jinx interprets it as Vi having replaced her and being on the verge of betrayal. Every detail is filtered through the lens of her abandonment trauma, further illustrating her difficulty in mentalization and establish a genuine interaction, not only with Vi, but with anyone else. And let's go back with Silco and the concept of identification with the aggressor. Recall that the whole explosive incident was primarily sparked by the fight with Silco. So, left alone, Jinx is then rescued by Silco. In effect, everything that happened becomes attributed to him, even though she isn't aware enough of it. And rather than rejecting him, Powder clings to him because he's an adult and she has no one else. Silco recognizes her vulnerability and takes her in, renaming her Jinx. She accepts this change and bids farewell to her former self, a self that had caused her so much pain. Paradoxically, Powder ends up aligning with the very person who precipitated Vanda's downfall and all the ensuing chaos. Stan and Farron discuss the identification with the aggressor, a defense mechanism where the individual unconsciously adopts the aggressor's traits, values, and behaviors as a way to combat the traumatic fear. Why does she do this? Because, as I mentioned, survival. is at stake. She's a little girl in a horrific war-torn world, and by internalizing Silco's ruthless persona and violent methods, she shifts from a passive victim role to at least an active one as a perpetrator. This gives her the illusion of control. Now she's feared instead of fearing, but it also means she inflicts tremendous pain on those around her and also to herself because she's been self-destructed in many episodes because she doesn't deserve to be surrounded with people and to be happy. Jinx's story reflects this conflict. Her emotions of fear and guilt were never truly validated by any adult after the tragedy. In the aftermath, Vi shocked Liz, and Silco demands that she forget her former self. This leaves Jinx in a state of chronic invalidation of her own being. She no longer knows who she is and must learn to regulate her emotions despite not even understand how this works. A fragmentation that manifests as emotional dysregulation, a hallmark not only in childhood trauma but also in, we can say, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, where identity becomes fragmented. The transformation from Powder to Jinx is one of the central axes in Jinx psychopathology. We observe a dissociation between her past identity and the present role she adopts, a role that, at its core, it's marked by an innocent feel with insecurity. Because Powder represents her vulnerable self, who acknowledges that she might be unhelpful or even problematic, much like any other human being. In stark contrast, Jinx is the personality that emerged after the trauma. A reckless, violent, and volatile woman who seems almost insensitive to pain of others. Throughout Arcane, we see Jinx internally debating between these two phases, unable to integrate them into a current self of self. Otto Kemper describes this as an identity diffusion, a lack of an integrated, stable concept of oneself. The word Jinx cannot accept that she's also vulnerable, that she too feels pain and love due to her difficulty in defining herself and deeply understand others. People will appear unpredictable because herself is unpredictable. Her identity swings from one extreme to another. I'm completely vulnerable or I'm completely destructive. This splitting is common in borderline personality disorder, where such a defense mechanism is prominent. Kimber speaks about the tendency to split experience and perceptions into extremes because one cannot fully integrate how both good and bad aspects coexist. There is a kind of internal either or decision making. Sometimes everything is wonderful and other times everything is terrible. This inability to integrate positive, both negative aspects simultaneously leads Jinx to idolize figures like Vi and Silco until she fears betrayal. Until the fear of abandonment turns those figures entirely negative. As a result, her interpersonal relationship become unstable, much like what we see in individuals with BPD, who struggle to reconcile the fact that the same person can be both lovely and also hurt them. Another key symptom is the alternation of identity, an unstable self-image of sense of self. Kenver notes that identity diffusion is typically evidenced by an absence of an integrated concept of oneself, as we said. a reluctance or inability to define oneself, and great difficulty in establishing reciprocal relationships. This often goes hand in hand with impulsivity in risky or self-harming behaviors. All of these characteristics are present in Jinx. Sometimes she pursues chaos in a reckless, almost self-destructive manner, as if deep down she doesn't care whether she lives or she dies. As long as she can avoid confronting her own emotion, she will rather burn in flames or set the entire city on fire. Alongside this, we observe affective instability with marked mood swings. For instance, she can go into maniac euphoria to a homicidal rage and the desperate anguish within just minutes. Keep in mind that Jinx is still a teenager, she's an adolescent, and a full diagnosis is challenging at this stage because of her age. Nonetheless, we could describe her condition as in personality disorder in formation. And really, Jinx, well, she's not real, a character. But yeah, she also destroyed an entire city, so I think we don't need so many proof to tell if she would really need some help. So we have discussed this many times, but numerous authors have shown that the end of adolescence after a long history of trauma and dysfunctional attachments like Jinx experience, it's robustly associated with development of BPD. For instance, a study of 1989 study by Arcane revealed that 81 of the patients with BPD report experienced severe abuse or violence during childhood, a percentage much higher than found in other diagnoses. This helps explain the strong link between BPD and complex traumatic stress disorder in Jinx. So we can see all the characteristics in BPD and also those of complex PTSD. In many cases, these diagnoses appear comorbid, mutually reinforcing each other. In PTSD, we see nightmares, intrusive memories, and panic responses that also are present sometimes in BPD, while borderline organization further amplifies emotional dysregulation and colors her interpretation of interpersonal relationships. This combination is quite frequent. The comorbidity rate between PTSD and BPD is notably high, especially among individuals with chronic childhood trauma. One example of trauma in action is the trigger of unresolved memories, which overwhelms her emotionally, leading to flashbacks of Milo and Clegor's death and the terror of being abandoned once again. This in turn prompts disproportionate response that have little to do with the present moment. For example, like literally kidnapping Caitlyn or nearly killing her. Such reactions are interpreted as manifestations of deep-seated fear and invasive impulse rooted in trauma. And finally, I want to talk about Isha. I believe Isha is a key. A beautiful character who demonstrates that someone with BPD can indeed connect with another person, revealing Jinx as a sensitive person. She has a sensitive heart and enable her to reconnect with her roots in a less traumatic way. It's very moving to see how Jinx becomes a mirror for Isha. Jinx helps her become responsible for a vulnerable child. You could even view this as a reflection of Jinx's own lost innocence, a reminiscence of the mute little girl she once was, much like Powder. So despite being this chaotic, violent, pursued by everyone in sound, by all Piltover, hated by the world, she has to assume a protective role. she must show even a bit of empathy and vulnerability, and in doing so, awaken her true self. That part which still craves care and a genuine human connection, returning to Funagi's ideas about mentalization. Through Isha, Jinx demonstrates her capacity to understand that the other human beings have their own thoughts and feelings. Sometimes, something that is very challenging for someone with BPD in vulnerable situations. Isha's vulnerability and the fact that she depends entirely on Jinx allows Jinx to protect her without the fear of losing her. From the moment she met Isha, Jinx was determined. I don't care about anything. She was determined. Moreover, Jinx is a true big sister. I will say, yeah, my big sister is really brave. It's really cool if I was Isha. We see that she still experienced an internal conflict, but now in a much kinder way. Enables her to approach her lost childhood and her own path. We see that she still experienced an internal conflict, but now in a much kinder way. Enables her to approach her lost childhood and her own path. Well, this is Mika from the future, and I lost the conclusion. But the conclusion is that Jinx suffered a lot, and that's why we understand how she might react. And if we have to guess or hypothesize a diagnosis to her, I will be closer to, I don't know if BPD because of the hallucinations. Well, again, it's a fictional character, but I like to bring this kind of topics so we can learn about psychology in a much approachable way. Also because I love Jinx and I really like Arcane. I think art, it's one of the most important things in humanity, that we have to express feelings, to express the mentalization part of being human. So if you like it, share, like, leave your comments below. And if you want me to analyze another character or something else, just let me know. Bye!